Well, I think it's fair to say we are well and truly into floater fishing season, and I've actually been doing a bit of it myself this year. I don't normally get around to it, and then when I do, I try and film it, and trying to film it and concentrate on actually catching fish on the top doesn't really happen. But I had a weekend where I went up to a campsite, took my van, we could park up next to the lake, fish from the van, and I actually done a load of surface fishing, caught a few nice ones, and even had to have my girlfriend help me lift a couple of carp because they were having it so much. I literally got one in the net, pinged it straight back out, got another one, and yeah, it was like that on a few occasions. So had some nice commons up to, I think it was just over £25 actually. So yeah, definitely had some nice fish. And then myself and Ian went last week and had a bit of a hectic day, got a few bites on camera, things like that. So it was really good fun. So I thought I'd talk you through the setup that I've been using, and probably the most important thing, the mainline I've been using, because a floater fishing mainline is a lot more important than you guys might think. So we'll come on to that in a little bit. But firstly, rod and reel. I'm using a really light setup. I've got a 9-foot 3-pound test curve retractable rod, and that's been perfect. I've been using this setup for quite a while. Now, 3 pound sounds a little bit heavy for surface fishing, but it's a couple of years old, so it's a little bit softer than 3 pound, and yeah, it works perfectly for it. The reel I've got is just a tiny little free spool reel, and the clutch is nice and smooth on it, which is really handy. No bait rudder, not really needed because obviously you're holding the rod the whole time anyway. So yeah, really nice little setup, nice and lightweight, means you can keep it in your hand for pretty much as long as you want because you don't end up getting tired. And I've spooled that up with the floating mainline. So on here, it's going to sound heavy, but I've got 15-pound Gardner HD Floater. 15-pound does sound heavy for floater line, but because it's actually a floating line, it's not like you've got 15-pound line cutting through the actual water because it sits on top of the water. And the reason I went for the 15-pound, there's basically 3 different breaking strains available. You can get 10, 12 and 15-pound. So I've gone for the heaviest. And the reason for that is you don't quite know where you're going to be surface fishing. Sometimes you might be kind of just putting some little floaters just along a tree line or amongst pads, things like that. And I'd rather have the strength of a decent main line and get less bites than have a thinner main line, get more bites but lose more fish. So I think that makes sense. So that's why I've gone for the 15-pound. I'm going to flash the diameters up on screen so you can see the actual thickness of them. But it's not overly thick for a 15-pound line. And that is basically going to a little controller float. Now this is the smallest interceptor, I think they're called. I've had it for years and I always use as small as I can get away with. Obviously you want to be able to cast past the fish so you can reel it back onto them so you're not spooking them, but generally I'm not fishing that far out. I do have bigger ones if I find that they're feeding at range and I'm spomming mixers and things like that, but for kind of everyday floater fishing, normally they're within 10-20 yards of where I'm feeding or where is castable. So that's why I use the smallest possible. And then we come onto the hook link, which I'm then using the 12-pound HD floater, which is the one that I've got here, because I like to use a slightly lighter hook link. So you've still got the 15-pound as a main line, but you've got a lighter hook link as well. So if anything did happen and you were to snap up, obviously you're not snapping up with potentially loads of line. The 12-pound should be the bit that goes really. So that's what I'm using. And I'm using about a 3-foot hook length. That is generally long enough to keep it away from the float and to not spook the fish too much. If you have a shorter hook length than that, then it does get closer and closer to the float and then it's a little bit more obvious. But saying that, what I have found on recent sessions is they're going for the float a lot. So the float doesn't seem to bother them at all. And then coming down to the actual hook end, I'm using a tiny little size 12 hook, micro barb, and then that's whipped on like KD style really. And then I've got basically a cut down pop-up. Now, I'm using the 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝗀 pop-ups, and these are actually a cork dust pop-up, so they're really buoyant, so you can cut them down pretty much the same size as the mixers you're putting out or whatever floating bait it is. So I've been using the krill floaters, obviously a very popular floater, but I've been using the 11mm ones and they've been getting the fish going quite well. They've been quite confident on them, so you can easily cut down a 15mm round pop-up down to 11mm of floater sort of size. And these 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝗀 ones are a very similar colour to the floaters that I'm putting out. So that is the actual setup. So it's pretty simple really, and yeah, generally it's getting quite a few bites, so I can't complain on that setup at all, and I'm not losing any fish that way either. I've had a few that have been darting into pads and snags, and like I say, by using the thicker mainline, it really does help. It gives you that more kind of resistance against snags and pads. So yeah, really happy with this little setup. That's what I've been using. But if we move on to the line a little bit more and kind of why you need a dedicated floater line. So like I said, this is the Gardner HD Floater, and that's what I've been using for both the main line and for the hook length as well. Now this is available in a couple of different colours. You can get a low vis kind of clear colour, or you can get a low vis green. Both of them have pretty much non-existent reflection from them, so obviously where it is a floater line, it's right on the surface, so if the sun's beaming down, you don't want it to reflect, because that is equally going to spook the carp as much as a line going directly through the water. So yeah, no reflection on them, and there's next to no stretch as well. There is a very little bit of stretch, which is needed really for when it comes to playing fish, but you want as little stretch as possible when it comes to actually striking. So the fact that it sits on the surface, so it's not into the water at all, that means when you pick up the line, you are simply picking it up off the surface when you come to strike. That aids with your it helps with your reaction time, and it also helps with, I guess, the responsiveness of picking the rod up to then setting the hook. But that combined with the low stretch nature of the line means that that responsive time is even quicker than it would be using like a floating mono. It is a mono, but it's a low stretch mono. I think that all makes sense. So the combination of the two means that as long as your reactions are pretty good, you should be setting the hook pretty much every time. And I have noticed a difference. It definitely does help out. So these actually come in 250 meter spools. And what I found with using a smaller reel like I've got here is I didn't need to put any backing on it. I could pretty much just reel this straight off this spool onto mine, and it filled it. So it worked really well. Obviously by having that slightly thicker, more hard wearing line, it's going to take that, generally spools will take a little bit less. So yeah, 250 meters was ample. And then obviously I've got 250 meters of the 12-pound as well. So that's a lot of hook links, but it's cheap as well. So you can get this for £6.30. I found it online for a 250 meter spool. So there's not really any excuse. It's not like buying a new line for your main setup where it's 20 quid minimum for a spool. £6.30 and you've got a dedicated floater line. Yeah, the benefits outweigh the cost. So I think that's probably the best way of putting it. It's not going to break the bank, but it could definitely lead to more fish on the bank. Ah, managed to tie that in. So if you want any more information about this, head over to the Gardner website where there is a few more specs. Hopefully this video has been useful to you, and hopefully you guys managed to catch a few off the top.